Through talks of sanctions and oil prices and the economic burden the rest of the world is willing to bear, and the sad but orderly scenes so many of us have seen of Ukrainian refugees leaving for other countries, the New York Times is forcing us to confront the human toll of Russia's invasion with a graphic photo on today's front page showing a family moments after they were hit by a mortar, killing the mother and two kids, wounding the man who also later died. They'd been trying to flee the town of Irpin, west of Kyiv, where the mayor says Russians have been intentionally targeting civilians as they have been elsewhere across Ukraine. It's a level of cruelty that's hard to wrap your head around. As international affairs expert Tom Nichols recently wrote in The Atlantic, night after night I find myself staring at the television, almost paralyzed with anger and grief. Russian President Putin, after a catastrophic strategic miscalculation, is now embroiled in perhaps the greatest military blunder in modern European history. And for those interested in rewriting the history that led to all this, Nichols isn't having it, as he proved on MSNBC last night after a fellow guest defended Donald Trump's Ukraine policy and claimed the former president had been tough on Russia.
I can't let it stand to say that Trump was somehow tough on Russia here. There has to be a correction involved because the policies of the U.S. government were tough on Russia, put in place under Bush and Obama. Trump was impeached specifically because he was trying to get other people to break the law to undermine those existing policies because he didn't want to be perceived as rolling back those policies. I have to make that correction.
And I'm glad he did, and that he joins me now. Tom Nichols is a regular contributor to The Atlantic and author of its Peacefield newsletter. Tom, it's good to see you again.
You too, Jim.
So on your Twitter account, I read essentially that the worst is yet to come for Ukraine, but the Russians will lose the war. Could you explain both?
Well, the initial Russian war plan has gone completely to hell. They were supposed to sweep in and have this thing done and be greeted as liberators and replace the Ukrainian government with a puppet government, all within maybe a week to 10 days. That has completely unraveled. And so the Russians are going to go back to the only playbook they know, which is to flatten everything in sight and to level buildings and to kill civilians. But in the end, Putin either has to occupy this country forever, which he can't do, or he's going to have to accept some kind of outcome where he's going to end up having to withdraw without completely subjugating Ukraine. And so even if he wins in the short term, he loses. And I think that this has really been a disastrous miscalculation for Russia that's going to cost Russia years of development economically, as well as militarily.
I want to return to that in a couple of minutes. You wrote in The Atlantic, sitting on your couch, looking over at your wife as tears were welling in her eyes, and you said you felt hopeless. By the way, I've had the exact same experience, both of them, sitting on my couch. But you go on to say that the worst thing we could do, we being the U.S. or NATO, is to get directly involved. And your reasoning goes beyond the conventional reasoning that it means World War III. Why would it be a horrible mistake, according to you, Tom?
Because right now, the only thing that can save Putin and extricate him from this disaster is a NATO intervention. His people are against it. The world is against him. And I think in some ways, if the man is capable of praying at all, he's praying for a NATO intervention, because then he'd be able to rally his country, rally his military, fight the war that his military has been preparing to fight for decades, and be able to turn to the world and say, see, this really was about NATO. This really is about Russian security. When, in fact, it's not about any of those things. It's about him trying to crush a democracy of 40 million Slavs that are just too close to his border.
So even if your analysis is right, and it appears the governments of all the NATO nations, including the United States, seems to agree it's a horrible mistake, if the atrocities pile up, as they already are, and or Zelensky is deposed, is the West able to resist direct intervention as everybody sits home at night having the exact same experience you did on your couch?
Well, I suspect there won't be any choice, because for NATO to intervene, it would take a unanimous vote of 30 member nations, and I don't think that's going to happen.
How about us?
Well, I think the United States going in without NATO is highly unlikely to happen. President Biden just spent a lot of political capital to get us out of Afghanistan. And I think, as I say in the piece, it is to our shame, but the United States has managed to sit by and watch a lot of humanitarian disasters. We didn't intervene when nearly 1 million people were killed in Rwanda. We are still standing by, even though the death toll in Syria has now reached something like 600,000.
Yeah, but we didn't all sit home and watch that on television and see every family either slaughtered or interviewed or stopped from crossing the border. Isn't that a different dynamic in 2022?
It might be. The power of images can rouse people to great anger, and I feel that anger, and this is Kiev's a place I've been. I have been to Odessa and many other places in Ukraine. I'm also I'm an Orthodox Christian. I mean, I'm watching a fraternal bloodbath between people of my own religion. But as I say in the piece, I just don't think emotion is a good guide to policy. I think if we wade into this, it saves Putin in the long run, and let us not ignore the problem you mentioned earlier, Jim, which is that it could turn into a general European war and perhaps even a world war.
Speaking of that, I want to play for you. Here is President Zelensky speaking Sunday in a Twitter video, speaking to international leaders. Here he is.
It's your humanitarian duty to protect us, to protect civilians. And you can do it. If you don't do it, if you don't at least give us airplanes so we can defend ourselves, the only thing we can think is that you also want us to be killed slowly.
And we appear to be giving him airplanes indirectly. Apparently, it's in the works that Poland will provide the Ukrainian forces with airplanes they can fly. We'll backfill that, I guess, is the theory. Why is that less to be recognized by Putin as a direct involvement of the United States than a direct involvement is, if he chooses to call it that?
Well, first, I don't criticize Zelensky for trying to get all the help he can get. That's just, the man is under siege and he wants help to come from wherever it can come for his country. But there are differences. Ukrainian pilots flying missions, just like Ukrainian soldiers using javelins and stingers, is different than having American or British or German or Dutch troops fighting against the Russian military. And I think people should understand something. When we talk about things like a no-fly zone, I think Americans have come to believe that terms like this are magic. Most of the killing that's being done is being done by Russian ground units, not from the air. And if you put in a no-fly zone, you're going to end up tempted to do a kind of Libya operation where you fly over the country, but you also strike military targets on the ground. And I think if people need to know what they're talking about here, to what they're embracing. If you want to engage in direct military action with the United States and NATO against Russian forces, then you need to say so. Terms like no-fly zone are comforting euphemisms that really mean war. And the only thing that'll save the Ukrainians are destroying those units on the ground. And people need to think about what's involved with that if Americans and other members of Western nations are the ones doing that, rather than Ukrainians being given the tools to do it for themselves.
We only have a couple of seconds left. I want to return to what you said earlier. So you think the slaughter continues, and at some point when Putin realizes that he can't hold this country, he slinks home, and that's how this thing ends?
He's not going to slink home. He's going to sit on a lot of territory. He's going to leave forces in place. We'll probably get chunks of Ukraine being in another frozen conflict like the Donbass. But the original plan of sweeping in, replacing the government, and then recreating Ukraine as some sort of member of a Russian federation, which was really the plan, isn't going to happen. And someone is probably telling Putin that right about now.
Well, including you. Tom Nichols, thanks so much for your time as always. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.